Let's spend some time now looking at how the brain is studied. So, how the brain works has been studied since the era of the ancient Egyptians, but neuroscience has developed rapidly as a discipline in recent years, and it encompasses elements of molecular biology, the study of human behavior and psychology, anatomy, and more. So, through specialized brain scanning equipment that we're going to be talking about, scientists can see how the connections in the brain are functioning. They can identify damage, and they can investigate the effects of impaired neural pathways on the body and on the mind. There are three major approaches or methods that can be used to study or image the brain. And the first category is radiation. We'll be looking at that. The next is magnetic fields, so the use of those through MRIs and fMRIs. And then we can also study the brain by looking at its electrical activity or through an EEG. Let's first take a look at brain imaging with radiation. The first one I'd like to share with you is the CT scan. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see an image, a screenshot of brain images from letters A through H, and these are images that were taken using a CT scan. So a CT scan uses a series of X-ray beams that are passed through the head, and then the images are developed on sensitive film. And so what's happening is that you're getting cross-sectional images of the brain that show the structure of the brain, but these images are not showing the function. Now, if you look at the image up on the left-hand corner, you'll see that these are images that are providing information about activity. And this is from a PET scan. And here we have three different PET scans. You look at the first image on the left, you'll see a normal or typical PET scan or normal or typical individual who's had a PET scan. And so we see here consistent metabolic activity throughout the cerebral cortex. In the center image, what we see is an individual who has Alzheimer's dementia, and we see in particular reduced metabolic activity in the temporal and parietal lobes. So if you look at the activity of both the image on the left and the image in the center, it's very different. And then we can see the image on the right, and we see that this too is different. And this individual has frontal lobe dementia. And here we see reduced metabolic activity in the frontal lobe. So how is this done? How is this type of testing done? Some of you may have had a PET scan before, or you may have had a family member who's had a PET scan, so you might have some familiarity with this type of scan. It is providing very important information about the activity in the brain, and it's doing this because the scanner is detecting radioactive material that has been injected or inhaled. And it's not just the material itself that it's detecting, though. It's detecting the activity of this material. So some of the commonly used material that might be used in this type of imaging could include oxygen, fluorine, carbon, and nitrogen. And then when this material gets into the bloodstream, it goes to areas of the brain that use it. So oxygen and glucose accumulate in brain areas that are metabolically active. And when the radioactive material breaks down, it's giving off, and this is beyond what you need to know for your test, but for some of you who might be curious, it's giving off a neutron and a positron. And when a positron hits an electron, both are destroyed and gamma rays are released. And so gamma rays are detecting the brain area where the gamma rays or gamma ray detectors are detecting the brain area where the gamma rays are emitted. And so this type of method is providing the physician, it's providing the neuroscientist, it's providing them with information about the function of the brain. And we can look at different areas of the brain and see what parts of the brain are most active when we engage in certain thoughts or when we do certain things. So a person might be asked to be, they might be put into a PET scan, and then they might be asked to imagine playing tennis, for example, or they might listen to music, or they might be asked to think about someone, let's say that they're studying love. They might want to know how love is shown, or is, what happens in the brain when we feel love. And of course, there are different types of love. So we might want to study maternal or paternal love, so being a parent and having the love towards your child versus the love you might have towards your partner. And so they could ask a participant to be in the PET scan, and while they're in the PET scan, they might be asked to think about their child. And then they might later be asked to think about their partner, and assuming they love their partner. And so then we would likely, very likely, we would be able to see distinct differences in activity in the brain between these two types of thoughts. We might also want to study things like, how do the brains of individuals who are very talented in music differ than those who are not as talented, when both are thinking about music, or when both are humming, or both are listening to music. And so we could look at activity differences in the brain in particular areas that are associated with music. We also could look at brain activity when someone is looking at an advertisement. And actually, there are people who are in a field called neuromarketing. And in this particular field, researchers examine how the brain responds to different types of advertisements. And researchers have actually been able to predict, based on what they see happening in the brain, which advertisements are going to be most effective. And in particular, I remember reading each year, I like to see what the neuromarketers have had to say about the Super Bowl advertisements. And it's very interesting to see. You can see that as the advertisement is taking place, they show in parallel, and you can just do a search for neuromarketing and the Super Bowl, and you can find this online. And you can find that you'll see that the advertisement will be playing, and you'll see the brain activity taking place in the individual watching the advertisements. They're playing that for you as a viewer online. They're sharing this with you. And what they've been able to predict is which Super Bowl ads are going to be the most effective. You know how these ads are often ranked in terms of what's the most effective, what do people tend to like the best, and they found that those that tend to be the most emotional, that evoke those deep emotions, and they're able to see that in the brain, that those are the ones that tend to be the most effective. The brain can also be studied through the use of magnetic fields. So an MRI examines brain anatomy. Some of you may have had an MRI before, or you may have had a family member who's had an MRI. And in an MRI, the machine is generating a strong magnetic field, and hydrogen atoms in the body move. And then the magnetic field is turned off and hydrogen atoms return. And then this emits electromagnetic signals, which then the computer reads and it interprets. So the image that you saw just a moment ago, that's an example of an MRI image. Now, an fMRI is different from an MRI in that it's not providing you information just about brain anatomy, but instead it's adding to this and providing information about brain functioning. So it has the same principles as the MRI, but it's showing changes in the brain over time. It's tracking blood flow and oxygen levels. So we can also gain insight into what's happening in the brain through studying the electrical activity that's taking place. And some of you may have had an EEG before, also known as an electroencephalogram. And this works on the premise that information is processed in the brain as electrical activity in the form of action potentials or nerve impulses that are transmitted along neurons. So EEGs measure this electrical activity through electrodes that are attached to the scalp, just like you see in this image here of this young girl. And small electrical charges that are detected by the electrodes are then graphed over a period of time. And this is then indicating the level of activity in the brain. So for any of you who may have had an EEG before, you may have had an EEG because you had the symptoms of a sleep disorder. This information that's garnered from an EEG can provide a sleep specialist or sleep researcher with information about what stage of sleep you're in when activity is taking place. So let's say, for example, you're in a sleep study and they notice that typically people go through a series of stages, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then back up and then into REM. We'll be looking at this in the next chapter. And they might note, for example, that during the time when you would be in a deep sleep, when your brain activity is going to be slowed down, that you have high blood pressure or that you have some other unusual activities taking place. And so an EEG would provide useful information to the sleep specialist about the stage of sleep that you're in so that they can then compare it to what else is happening in your body. They're also able then to know how much time you're spending in each stage of sleep. Are you spending a sufficient amount of time in each stage of sleep? What's happening during each stage? For example, during REM, typically we are in a state of what we would call paradoxal sleep, where we are essentially paralyzed. We have very minimal movement, and yet our brain is very active. So if we're in REM, as shown by the EEG, and our body is also very active, then this is indicative of a sleep disorder that we'll be looking at in the next module. This is actually indicative of what's known as REM sleep behavior disorder. EEGs can also be useful in detecting illnesses like epilepsy. They also can be useful in diagnosing other disorders that could affect brain activity like Alzheimer's. And an EEG can also, or has been useful in terms of research in helping sleep researchers to understand REM sleep and the purpose of REM sleep. So what have you learned so far in this module video? Well, overall, you learned about the importance of brain imaging. You learned about the CT scan, the PET scan, the MRI, and the fMRI. And you also learned about the EEG, which we'll be exploring more in the next module. What will you be learning about next? Well, in our final video in this module, you'll be learning about the endocrine system. You'll learn about the overall function of this system, and you'll also be learning about hormones. So I look forward to seeing you in our next video.